Hello and welcome to the Deming Conversation. I'm joined today by John Bicheno, but before I start, I will let John introduce himself and then we'll take the conversation from there.
Well, thank you, James. Of course, I'm John Bicheno, and I'm actually retired, although I'm still interested in lean. One of my claims to fame, if you like, was that I used to run an MSc in lean at Cardiff Business School for about 16 years, which then moved to the University of Buckingham. As you say, I'm still learning about lean, and there's lots to learn about all the time.
Good. And I have to say, John, a friend of mine went on that MSc and he raves about it all the time. So I suppose the joy of these Deming conversations is I get to talk to interesting people about a whole host of interesting topics. And what we're going to talk today, I suppose, is we're going to try and debunk a great management myth. And that management myth is that really, if you want to keep your costs as low as possible, you have to have everything working at full utilization. So 100% efficiency is the goal.
Right.
So that's the management myth. John, tell me, why is cost efficiency in that way a bit of a fool's errand?
Well, James, what we're going to be looking at here is essentially queuing, and queuing actually happens in both manufacturing and service. So it's a sort of a universal phenomena, and there are many queuing formulae and queuing analyses, but the one that I think is most useful is the so-called Kingman's equation, which is the equation for the average queue length. So so Kingman's equation has variables: arrival variation, process variation, and utilization, plus the time, the service time. So maybe 3 or 4 variables. And why we're concerned with this is because queues happen, as we said, everywhere in both manufacturing and service. And queues, they annoy people. They lead to cost, maybe cost, and of course, queues can also be in terms of people waiting for service, but they could also be in terms of inventory. So queues also take up space, and quite interestingly enough, queues also lead to deterioration in quality, because if you've got a long queue, your chance of picking up a problem is decreased with a longer queue. So for all those reasons, I think queuing is a very important topic in this area of lean, and should be, and I'm sure should be something that many managers should be aware of.
How does utilization affect queuing then?
Okay, utilization is essentially demand divided by capacity, or if you like, load divided by capacity. So what we're concerned with here is pretty well mainly on bottleneck processes or heavily loaded processes. In many factory or office situation, you will have various stages that are not very highly utilized, but there will be a number of stages that are heavily utilized. And the point about this is that there's a non-linear effect between utilization and queue length. So I think a lot of managers, or at least some managers, think that there's a linear effect. In other words, if you double the utilization, you double the queue length. In fact, that's absolutely not true, particularly at higher levels of utilization. So there's an exponential kind of shape of this. So the difference between, say, 80% utilization and 90% utilization, just 10% difference, could lead to doubling in queue length, for example.
So can you give me an example of that, a real-world example?
We often know about the effects in driving on a motorway, so that you're driving along quite happily, and maybe the motorway is relatively full, but it's going along quite happily. And then just there's some sort of relatively minor disturbance, and suddenly the queue explodes. Or more dramatically, sometimes there's roadworks, and so what was previously quite a happy driving experience turns out to be quite a nightmare. So this is what we pick up on. This is the non-linear effect, which I think we've all experienced. I think, yeah.
Yeah, and presumably the reverse is true then as well. So when you're on the motorway, all of a sudden the queue can just seem to vanish for no reason whatsoever.
Exactly, yes. So with the, yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I got that. And there is actually a game which I've seen you play, which demonstrates this really, really beautifully.
Yes, so we have a very simple little dice game to show this. In fact, it does appear in. I have a book, the Lean Games and Simulation book, which.
Okay.
But actually, I'm happy to distribute this free of charge if you like. It's a simple game.
Oh, that's great. So I'll make sure that goes in the show notes and people can get it.
Yeah, fine.
Okay. So the Kingman equation. So you say there were sort of 3 or 4 elements to this.
Yes. So just to repeat a little bit, it's a rival variation. So it's, for example, the distribution of customers arriving at a service point, a service operation. The process variation, that is how long the process takes, maybe how long the server takes to actually serve a customer. And the third aspect is utilization. In other words, how busy the server is. And the fourth aspect is just the average service time, how long it takes to service the average customer whilst actually serving is taking place. Those are the critical things. Now, the point is that quite a lot of people are concerned with process variation. So, for example, in the area called Six Sigma, there's a lot of attention towards process, the variation of the process, but there's hardly anything about arrival variation. So one of the messages that I'm trying to often put across is that in Kingman's equation, these factors are equally weighted. So process variation and arrival variation count the same. If you only go to look at the process variation, you're only, of course, looking at half the problem. And moreover, sometimes in some respects, arrival variation can be manipulated or changed relatively easily or cost effectively, I should say.
Okay. So coming back to your example of the motorway, then if you can whiz around the M20, you quickly get caught in sort of mandatory speed limits. But the fact that they are slowing people down effectively changes arrival variation. Is that, have I got that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So often there's speed limits, and it's just a little bit counterintuitive. So why is it that highway engineers or traffic police try to slow down the average speed at busy times? In a way, it's counterintuitive because you might think, well, if the motorway is busy, they should go faster. But what they're actually trying to do is to reduce the average, the average speed, because of course, if let's say the speed limit is 70 miles an hour, certainly there'll be a few people that are doing 90 miles an hour, but there'll still be one or two people doing 30 miles an hour. So that has a larger variation. So by reducing the speed limit, they're trying to reduce the variation. So that's one aspect, one way in which traffic police try to do things. Another way is on access control. Now, there's a few examples of this on various British motorways. Is that they have a traffic light which only allows cars onto a motorway at if you like, non-busy times, or at least gaps in the distribution. But those are two sort of simple ways in which arrival variation can be influenced.
And what about manufacturing processes or the service industry? Can you think or give us some examples how you can reduce arrival variation there?
Well, yes. Generally speaking, you can think about that there are two forms in this. That is externally generated and internally generated. So externally generated is where the variation occurs by some factor that's outside the control or influence of the process itself. So, of course, in many service operations and manufacturing operations, there obviously is variation, but just ways in which it could be influenced is by simply giving information, saying, we're the bank or whatever is busy at certain times of the day. And you find this in call centers as well. Another way is via pricing, of course, so which is very common in many kinds of service operations to try and influence demand. So that's external. Internal variation. I mean, a classic case of internal variation is amplification. And the big one here is something called the bullwhip effect. So the bullwhip effect is if you've got a supply chain, as orders move through the supply chain, what happens is that the orders become amplified because people along the supply chain, the decision makers along the supply chain, are trying to protect themselves. They don't want to be out of stock, so they just allow for extra orders, if you like. But then that happens at one stage and is passed on to the next stage, which also orders a few extras. So by the time it gets to the actual manufacturer or supplier, there's quite a lot of amplification. That's a classic occurrence. Of course, it requires quite a lot of coordination to do something about it. So it's, but essentially, it is a well-known phenomenon.
Yeah, I can actually, now you said that, I can think of an example myself. I used to work for a bank, and this is going back to the early 2000s. Email wasn't really a thing. So I think we were probably the biggest junk mail poster in the UK. Maybe it's not something to brag about, but I think we probably were. But of course, the marketing guys were hell bent on reducing their costs. And the way they did that was they released everything into the mail all on the same day, because then they get the biggest postal discount.
Yeah, exactly.
But of course, when we were sitting in the call center, we just got walloped,
Yes.
calls coming out of our ears. But we were our own worst enemy, because it really was feast or famine, but we were creating that variation within the business.
Yes. So, so batching, in fact, is a classic phenomenon. So let's say you have one order per hour coming in, which would be nice, smooth demand. And then what happens is that you have some sort of procedure which says that we're not going to produce one per hour. We're going to produce, let's say, one per day, so a batch of 8. But in so doing, you actually increase the variation. So this is done supposedly on the basis of economics. Now, there might be something to this, but a way to address this would be, of course, via the good old lean concept of setup reduction or changeover reduction. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any other examples you can think of where organizations have reduced demand variation and that's had a positive effect?
Well, basically every organization has what we call Pareto demand. So in other words, if across a period, there'll be a number of popular products and a large number of less popular products. So just by understanding that variation and maybe changing the price or scheduling them so that you produce the regular orders more regularly and the irregulars you move to the side. That has a smoothing effect, which is in fact this is sort of classic lean stuff or classic lean scheduling procedure that is adopted. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then you've got how do you reduce arrival variation? Your next stage is the whole question of how do you reduce process variation? But of course, those two things are then linked to your point about the bullwhip effect, because in any supply chain, process variation can create arrival variation in the next stage.
Yes. So, of course, in any manufacturing and or service operation, there will obviously be variation. But there are things that one can do about it. So that first of all is really appreciating the kinds of process variation. So that in, for example, service, you will know that some customers take a lot of time, and other customers maybe your more experienced customers take less time because they're familiar with the process. So what, for example, car hire companies do, they may have a separate lane for experienced customers, so which they don't then have to explain the whole process. So this reduces the process variation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah,
So
okay.
again, it's understanding the sources of variation, I think, is the key to do this.
Yeah. And so then there is a lean term for this then, isn't it? Overburden. Well, I can't remember what the Japanese word for it is.
Okay. Yes. So a big thing in lean is about the reduction of waste, or muda, as it's called. So in fact, Womack and Jones's famous book, Lean Thinking, the first sentence of Womack and Jones's book was muda. It's the one Japanese word you've got to understand. So the Toyota production system is very much focused on the reduction of waste, or muda. But actually, in the Toyota system, they don't only talk about muda, they also talk about muri and mura. Mura is amplification or variation, and muri is overload or utilization. So in fact, I often talk about Kingman's equation. I'm pushing my luck a little bit on this one, saying that it's the equation of lean, because it incorporates muda, the Q, with mura, the amplification or variation, and muri, the overload or utilization. So hence Kingman's equation ties all these three nicely together.
Yeah. Okay. So if I just go back over what you told me so I understand it, one of the basic problems is people believe that what they should be doing is running at maximum utilization. The minute you start running at maximum utilization, though, because of this non-linear effect, you just generate huge queues. And I speak as a man who's worked in several call centers in my life. I've experienced some pretty huge queues, and they're not pretty. And you're right, they are. They're hugely expensive things.
Yeah.
So rather than focusing on utilization, people will be far better off focusing on reducing variation, both in process and in arrival, and that would reduce those queues substantially and therefore reduce the cost.
Well, it's not. You
not
really
quite
need
that
to,
simple.
you really need to focus on all three. So what can you do about arrival variation? What can you do about process variation? And what can you do about utilization? Now, utilization is about demand. Now, there's various categories of demand. So again, as with variation, talk about internal and external, but the same thing happens with demand. So an example of internally generated extra demand is a classic one, of course, is rework. So if you have to rework a product, that means that it has to go through a process more than once. So, of course, it adds to the load, or it adds to the demand. So by tackling rework, actually can reduce the demand, and that has in fact a non-linear effect on queues. Okay, an example of externally generated demand would be what John Seddon famously is called failure demand. Failure demand is not getting it right the first time, but essentially that's the same sort of thing. Is that if you can reduce failure demand, you'll try to make sure that customers are dealt with right first time, then that reduces the load. So. So you need to focus on both these things, both these, all these causes. Again, there are relatively simple things that you can do here, but a very simple thing to reduce demand is simply overproduction. Like if in manufacturing, so where this machine is set up and we're supposed to make a batch of 100, but while the machine is set up, we'll just make an extra 50, or whatever the case might be. Well, this is overproduction, so it's one of Ono's classic wastes is overproduction. Now, the consequences of that can be seen directly through Kingman's equation, because it loads up demand and reduces the queue. So Actually, it's kind of interesting. If you can reduce demand, then you reduce utilization. If you reduce utilization, you reduce the queues. You reduce the queue exponentially, not linearly. The denominator of the equation, load divided by capacity or demand divided by capacity. If you can free up some capacity, you increase your capacity, you reduce your utilization, it reduces your queue, not linearly, but exponentially. So this is the power of this thing, that by getting after these relatively simple, straightforward things, you can have a dramatic non-linear effect, which is, I think, something that's not every manager appreciates.
Yeah. And so I remember once I was working with a lean consultant. Actually, he said to me, the problem is, James, when you start to chase the costs, they run away from you. But people chasing costs will screw down their efficiency to make it as highly utilized as possible. They will start to batch things up. But as you've explained, all of these things actually increase queue lengths, which then in turn just drives cost into your organization. So it is counterintuitive.
Yes.
But the way to look at it is to understand the system and then start to pull out the levers that will reduce those costs.
Yes, that's right. We like to say that lean requires a sort of a systems approach. So you need to understand all the factors, the people factors, the non-people factors, but also some of the accounting factors. I think quite a cause of these things that we're talking about, like increasing utilization, is simply because the organization is using some sort of accounting system which tracks variance, which really has the effect of encouraging greater utilization. There's quite a number of examples of traditional accounting getting in the way of lean. So another example really relating to demand is that in some sort of traditional accounting, inventory is an asset. Okay, so that means if you make more, that's good news. But in terms of lean, inventory is not an asset. Inventory is something that you want to reduce to be just in line with demand. So there's quite a number of examples of this which result from using wrong measures, which drive you to maybe overproduce.
Yeah, absolutely. So rather than just, because we could be here for hours talking about that, there's my pet subjects, they're very interesting stuff. Is there anything else we've missed talking about Kingman's equation, do you think?
So I think one of the early stages, not necessarily the first stage, but certainly an early stage in lean implementation, is a much more thorough understanding of demand, the causes of demand, and the drivers of demand. Yeah.
I suppose brings me to my last question then, which is, if people want to learn more, where would you point them? Where do you think they should to go to understand how all these things work?
I have a little bit of a prejudiced opinion on this one, having been written the Lean Toolbox and so on.
Yeah.
But these days there are such a lot of really great books on lean and so on. But I have some favorite websites. One of which is called All About Lean. That's by my friend Christoph Rosser. All About Lean is a nice website. There's also the classic books by Lean Enterprise Institute, which is like all sorts of things: value stream mapping, scheduling, whatnot. And of course, a very fashionable one, possibly, but a big one is so-called A3 problem solving. So A3 is really relates to homing in on the particular problem. Well, those would be a few things that I would focus on. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Is there anything that you think we have missed or totally missed the point of?
I would say that, first of all, Kingman's equation is a nice conceptual equation. So it talks about these factors: the arrival variation, process variation, and utilization. And the point is that arrival variation and process variation are equally weighted. So you need to give equal attention to those. And then utilization is the next factor. So But of course, the equation is not something you'd plug numbers into. It's really a conceptual equation and or a good explanation of the root causes of Q problems. So please don't try to plug a whole lot of numbers into it. I think you'll be in lots of trouble if you try to do that. Yeah.
Okay. And I would recommend as well for anybody who's interested, have a go at playing the game, because if you intrinsically think when people are screaming at you to have maximum utilization, you're just thinking this is nuts. The dice game beautifully explains why it isn't quite that way.
I'm a big fan of Kingman, so I've been after this for a long, long time, and because I think that it's something that is not widely appreciated. So it's good to be able to speak to you about it.
Super.
Fine.
Thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's very nice to speak to you, James. So yeah, it's.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.